All right, everybody, welcome to Comparative Classics. Today we are working our way through St. Augustine. We're officially halfway. Lengthwise, excuse me, I guess we're technically a little less than halfway, but after today we should be a bit, like, right on the center line of the book, so it'll be fun. I really want to get to the pure philosophy in the last 3 chapters. I'm not going to say it's my favorite part of the book, but it's the trippiest part of the book. It's hard to skip. But we'll do our best to get there. All right. Let me get my notes ready and give everybody a sec to click. Great, we'll start here. The hardest part of teaching online is trying to figure out a way to access my notes and my book and still keep the keyboard and computer in front of me without just, like, randomly hitting buttons that mess everything up. I think it's the best part of this whole thing. And by best, I mean it's aggravating, but it's also hilarious. Like, in 10 years, when I'm not teaching online all the time, be good stories. Although I think this is making me more of a Luddite. Luddite were the British political movement where they would literally attack and burn any new technology. I won't burn it, I just might not use it. Alright, let's get going today. Alright, so we got to book 4. By the way, I didn't change my pictures today. There's not that many nice pictures of Augustine, so I just kind of left them. Normally I have new pictures every time, but today I don't, so apologies. Okay, so we're going to continue with book 4. We're almost at the end. I think we finished at 11 on book 4. So we're going to start with 12 on book 4. Oh man, that's book 6. Wrong way. Here we go. Yeah, and somebody asked a question about this in our class already today, about the word, and what does the word mean, and what is logos, and we went into that a little bit. So that's what 11 was related to. Now 12. This one's interesting, actually, because sometimes Christians can be kind of, how can I say it? There's a certain branch of American Christians that seem anti-fun. That'd be a safe way to say it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look up Puritans and Calvinists, and then look up Baptists. They have a lot of, like, rules of, like, how to be a good Christian. And I'm not against rules, actually, but there's an interesting quote at the beginning of 12 here, where he says, and by the way, we may end early today if I manage to lose my voice. One thing that slowed me down this week, my voice isn't making it this week. I don't know why. I didn't even, like, go to a rock concert or anything, because we can't, right? But, so, I'll make it as far as I can. If we abruptly end, it's because I'm starting to creak, and my voice isn't making it. But I think I can make it a couple more hours. Okay, so 12, at the beginning he says, "If the things of this world delight you, praise God for them, but turn your love away from them and give it to the Maker." So the things that please you may not displease him. This is interesting, though. He doesn't say your delight is bad. Interesting. He says also, if your delight is in the souls, love them in God, because they are too frail to stand firm when only things cling to them. Because he mentions, like, he just talked about his dead friend, right? And where he kind of realized that loving things here, and the Buddhists would agree with this, actually, they're transitory, right? So naturally they'll cause you sadness. Now, when I say this is part of the nature of God, it's like the part of this is already assumed, because basically all delights have some connection to God. It says, then we get a little bit more of a, like, epistemology, like theology here. He says, "For when he made the world, he did not go away and leave it. By him it was created, and in him it exists." So this is the Greek idea. All the Christians have a more aspirational claim, right? He made material and idea reality, and he sustains it. That's in him it exists. So it's the sustaining of existence. What's a decent analogy for this? If reality is a simulation, then he's the hardware. He made the hardware it runs on and supplies the power. That's what it means by, like, through him it exists. And this is, whenever we taste the truth, God is there. He is in our very innermost hearts, but our hearts have strayed from him. Again, this is a nature of God with reality, right? He's sustaining it, he made it, but he's also constantly there with it. He didn't go away, because he's basically the true part. All the true parts are his like acknowledgments of intelligible reality. But then he asks a good question. Why would you choose to still travel by this hard and arduous path? There's no rest found where you seek it. So he's mentioning, like, if by basically rejecting God's truth, you're not living a very happy life. And again, we get another Christ. Somebody asked about bridegroom earlier here, and we get the quote here again. He says, quote, "Our life came down into this world and took away our death. He slew it with his abounding life, and with thunder of his voice he called us from this world to return to him in heaven." So it's another Christ reference, right? And this is where you get the connection. He talks about the Virgin Mary, and then he does, as bridegroom coming from his bed, he exulted like some great runner who sees the track before him. So this he is referring to as God, which is also Christ, because that's what Christians believe, right? And he talks about creation of the world here. So this is the connection, right? So that he's basically making a truth connection. So not just the relation, not just creation of reality, but God's relation to it. So, and the interesting aside is kind of the theory of delights and pleasures, that they're better with God, so why not do it? It's interesting. Next one. He then gets in kind of like his new distraction, which he kind of calls it. He gets into the nature of beauty a lot. So he says, this is 13, "I did not know this then." Right, so this book's not very linear. "I was in love with beauty as a lover of order, and it was dragging me down. I used to ask my friends, 'Do we love anything unless it is beautiful? What then is beauty, and what does it consist? What is it that attracts us and wins us over to the things we love?' He says, "Unless there was beauty and grace in them, they would be powerless to win over our hearts." So he started to look for beauty. He actually wrote a book on it. Again, well, as we mentioned, he has 115 existing books. He wrote even more books before he converted to Christianity, and we don't have any of those. But like, he did it. You're just like, wow. He's famous enough that we'll get to two of his job changes that come up today. Both of the job changes he got were based purely on his reputation. Because it's not like nowadays, like, "Do you have a recommendation?" It's like, no. People just had heard of him in Rome, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you're Augustine from Carthage. Hi, you want a job?" So it's interesting here. So he was a famous author even at this time, and he mentions he even forgot his book. It was called Beauty and Proportion. And then he kind of gets into like how his life worked at this time, and he talks about a guy called Hieraeus, a great public speaker of Rome, and he kind of gets into like how reputation worked, because we mentioned, this is what the connection was, me mentioning he got his job from knowing about a guy, right? Like, for people knowing about him, he makes an example of this guy too. He was impressed by the brilliant reputation of this man. He'd never met him or heard him speak, but he said, quote, "Even more than this, I was impressed by the admiration which other people had for him. They overwhelmed him with praise because it seemed extraordinary that a man born in Syria and originally trained to speak in Greek had later become so remarkable speaker of Latin." And then he kind of gets into the, what did I say in my notes? Power of reputation. He said, "We can admire persons whom we have never seen if we hear them praised, though this does not mean that simply to hear their praises will make us admire them. But enthusiasm in one man will kindle the same in another, for we admire the person who praises we hear only if we believe they are sincerely uttered." And he said, "In those days I admired people in this way. According to judgments I heard from others, not according to your judgments, my God, in whom no one is deceived." But he mentions too, I didn't actually admire this guy. He said it was something quite serious, the kind of admiration I should have liked to win for myself. So he points out, like, he was in it for looking, like, he wanted the qualities that Hieraeus had, but more he wanted, like, how could you say it? He wanted the glory and the honor. So it kind of gets into like kind of his definitely gets into his psychosis of like he wanted the praise this guy had. So it's a little bit on hero worship. That's what I wrote in my notes. So it kind of shows us, oh, that's not new. Is there anything else I want to add here? Nope, I like it. It's just interesting to think about, like, the attitude on, like, oh, there's celebrity back then, too. And I wonder if the psychology nowadays is true, too. People who like celebrities like them because they want the praise, too? I don't know. It could also just be Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is a German concept we don't have in English, which is something like taking pleasure in the suffering of others, or even more specifically, like taking pleasure in other people's suffering while we suffer. Like imagine like two ships sinking, but somebody else's ship is sinking faster and you're enjoying it. Does that make sense? That's Schadenfreude. So it might be that too, but he doesn't say that. That's my opinion. And finally we get to 15, where he mentions he didn't pivot yet. So he says, my thoughts ranged only amongst material forms. I define them in two classes. So he's kind of evolving his materialism. He's not pure Manichaean anymore. Those which please the eye because they are beautiful in themselves, and those which do so because they are properly proportioned in relation to something else. He says, my misconception of spiritual things prevented me from seeing the truth, although it forced itself upon my mind. If only I would see it. So he basically just became a materialist, trying to understand matter as matter. He does mention, though, I love the peace that virtue brings and hated the discord that comes from vice. I concluded that in goodness there was unity and evil disunion of some kind. It seemed to me this unity was the seat of the rational mind and was the natural state of truth and perfect goodness, whereas disunion consisted of an irrational life, which thought of a substance of some kind and was the natural state of ultimate evil. Sounds like Stoicism to me, right? So you see, like, he doesn't attribute it to any other reading, but you know what I mean? It sounds like Stoicism, very much so. And he says at the end of that, he says, but I did not know what I was saying because no one had taught me. I had not yet found out for myself that evil is not substance, and man's mind is not supreme good that does not vary. So he's still figuring out, like, proper balance. Then he says, this is interesting, kind of, he gets into psychology again, actually, talking about crimes against other men are committed when the emotions which spur us to action are corrupt and rise in revolt without control. Sins of self-indulgence are committed when the soul fails to govern the impulses from which it derives bodily pleasure. And he says, in the same way, if the rational mind is corrupt, mistaken ideas and false beliefs will poison life. In those days my mind was corrupt. I did not know what it was to share in the truth. It must be illuminated by another light, because the mind itself is not the essence of truth. So this is a key here, and he quotes the Bible a bunch after that. The real split is mind the end of truth, or does mind access the truth? This is kind of the big fight in ancient and the contemporary world, our world too, right? Do we make the truth in our minds, or is the truth external to our minds? This is one of the biggest fights in all philosophy for all of human time. So, what is the answer? Well, most of the books we read, I think all of them actually, the truth is external. Although it can be accessed through your mind. Buddhists would say that's possible. The Greeks would say it's possible. Confucians imply it's possible. Christians imply it's possible. Stoics also think it's possible, right? So this idea that you're not making the truth in your mind, like your reason isn't the end, but your reason can access or be illuminated. Remember we talked about the sun, right? He's making a Plato connection here. It can be illuminated by the truth. So again, though, this is still a real fight. And even in his book, when he's talking about like his beauty, right? If beauty is the good, this materialist two kinds of matter, then your mind can subjectively make what is beautiful. That's a modern art argument. But again, it's not modern. The ancients argued similar things. We're not that creative, everybody. People just, like, refuse to read books, and then they pretend they made up new ideas. It's my favorite. It's such a fun thing as somebody who studies the classic world, and then you find all these concepts. It's like, oh yeah, you're just like this. What do you mean? Oh yeah, you're just copying the old days. Oh, how dare you. And the end of this section actually has the part we already talked about in class, where it talked about the sweet truth being the bridegroom, which is, again, a reference to Christ, which is actually a reference to the beginning of... second paragraph on 12. So all of this is, like, hyperlinked. That's what I would say, right? It's interrelated, but if you don't see the relationships because you've never studied it, it might be less clear. That's what I'm here for, if I can help. All right, finally, the interesting one. It starts to show you kind of Augustine's natural skepticism. The last chapter, he talks about Aristotle's book. It's called one of many. It's called 10 Categories. I think in English we just call it. I think if we have it, we call it categories. I'm not 100% sure we actually have this one though. He mentions a lot of people read it and treated it as like a liberal arts holy book. And he says, other people told me I understood with difficulty after the most learned masters had not only explained it to them, but also illustrated it with a wealth of diagrams. But when I discussed it with them, I found they could tell me no more than they had already discovered by reading it. Oh, he had discovered by reading on his own. And he kind of goes into categories, which is substance and attributes. And then the quality of those people and the relations they have to other things. And this is funny. He asked, what profit was the studying done to bring me? None. In fact, it made difficulties for me because I thought if everything that existed could be reduced to these 10 categories. I therefore attempted to understand you, my God, in all your wonderful immutable simplicity in the same terms. So he tried to understand God as a material body, and he couldn't do it. And we'll talk about this as we go today. And one of his biggest catch-ups was he just couldn't conceive God materially, and that was just it was hard for him. And then he mentioned too, I read and understood by myself all the books that I could find on the so-called liberal arts. For those days I was a good for nothing and a slave to sordid ambitions. And like, what advantage did I get from them? The short version, not very much. But he said, I understood that I read the arts of rhetoric, logic, on geometry, on music, on mathematics. Since I made no offering of them to you, it did mean more harm than good to struggle to keep them in my own power so large a part of what you had given me, instead of preserving my strength for you. For what good was my ability if I did not use it well? So this is a bit of that Greek idea, the techna, right? Using your skills well, not just for your pure ambition, right? So it's being moral for moral's sake, or acting good towards God, which if Christians right, God is the biggest good. And he says, for ability I had, for until I tried to instruct others, I did not realize that these subjects were very difficult to master, even for pupils who were studious and intelligent. And a student who could follow my instruction without faltering was reckoned a very fine scholar. I'm reading to see if I want to add anything here. He mentions what's the point of intelligence a little bit here. Let me see. And he makes a conclusion something like that the kind of best use of your intelligence is like studying the material world in relation to God. He thinks that's the best way to do it. So he's not anti-intellectual. He's more like it's complementary intellectual. That's kind of his theory on this, which it's interesting. He didn't find the text by itself, though, that useful. All right. And we're done with book 4. Any questions before we move on to 5? I'll give us 20 seconds. I'll sip my tea. All right, let's keep going. Book 5. Again, I'm recycling pictures today. Apologies, but it was either this or Roman ruins, and I just like, we'll look at his face. It's fine. That is the wrong chapter. Okay, let's jump into 5. First, he mentions again, because this book is a combination like prayer, catechism, autobiography, and philosophy. Sometimes he jumps back into the prayer part of it, and 1 is back to that. He says, "Accept my confessions, O Lord. They are a sacrifice offered by my tongue. For yours was the hand that fashioned it, and your spirit moved me to acknowledge you." So this is his petition. He's reminding us, and right, it's to God, from his perspective, that this is kind of an offering, right? He's showing his contriteness. So again, he's one of the most prolific authors of all time, but he's still doing a mea culpa, right? Like mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. If you know what that means, I'm capable, right? Culpable means like I'm guilty. So this is his praise and his offering and his humility all at the same time. So, but it reminds us, why did he write this book, right? What's the purpose? All right. He then gets into 2. On 2, he talks a little bit about escaping truth. It starts with, "Let the wicked go on their way and fly from you, for they know no rest. But your eye can pierce the darkness, and you can see them." And again, this is, even though it's like trying to escape truth, it's also pointing out what philosophically Augustine conceives God's power as, right? All the world about them is teems with you the beauty, and they alone defile it. What harm can they be able to inflict on you? And he says, "What can they do to disgrace your rule, which reaches its invisible or indivisible justice from the heights of heaven to the meanest things on earth?" So 2, he talks a little bit about the justice of God. They have fled and hidden from you. They are blind and do not see God. They have offended, but you are there, because you abandoned no part of your creation. So again, remember, this is making basically the theological argument for where God is. Somebody asked a good question I'll interrupt for. Did he write this for personal use like Aurelius, or was this intending to be widely read? I think it's both. He's already, at this point, he's a famous man. So anything he wrote would be read. So he wrote it firstly for himself, but also to be read. That was the purpose of the book. Like I said, it's intended to be a philosophy and a catechism and a confession prayer and an autobiography, right? It's all together. Because definitionally, right, a saint is supposed to be someone who helps other people. And at the time he lived, right, he wasn't a saint. He didn't know that. But he's thinking, like, if my story can help people, I should publish it. That's kind of his theory. But yeah, it's more public intent than Marcus Aurelius, I think. But to be fair, Marcus was an emperor, right? So what's the chance somebody read his book? Pretty high, right? So his might have not been that humble either. You know, how many famous people get their stuff published? Most, right? So he kind of goes into this is again kind of epidemiology, and how the knowledge of God. So they will find that you have not deserted their creatures and who have deserted their Creator. Let them turn back, and they will find you in their hearts, and the hearts of all who confess you and throw themselves upon your mercy. So again, more traits of God, more knowledge of God. So that's what the part 2 is elaborating. Part 3, we start to get his deconversion from Manichaeism. So we fast forward in his timeline finally, the 29th year. So he's 29 years old. And he talks about a Manichaean bishop named Faustus who was coming to visit Carthage. Everybody said this guy was great, and he's coming, and that Manatees, and he had started to doubt, Augustine had kept studying, and he studied scientists and philosophy, and he started to realize science was descriptive and math and philosophy of reality better than Manichaeism, and all the Manichaeism said, wait, don't worry, when this guy Faustus comes, you'll definitely understand our point. And let me see here. He also emphasizes the fact at this point he'd gotten much better at separating rhetoric from truth, which is the start of his doubt. So finally, he's starting to see, like, oh, rhetorical ability and truth aren't always correlated. And where is this? Is there any other point I want to make here? And he goes a lot into wisdom in 3 here, kind of like what is wisdom and how do we have it? What is reason? How does it work? Because this is where he'd kind of say the limit of science is. He says, much of what they say, scientists, about created world is true, but they do not search with piety for the truth, its creator. This is why they do not find him, or, if they find him, and have knowledge of God, they do not honor him or give thanks to God. They become fantastic in their notions who they claim to be wise. And so this is the problem, though. What's the Christian problem with any science? Attribute to themselves what is yours, and in the same perverse blindness they try to ascribe their own qualities to you. They even attribute falsehoods to you who are truth itself. He says that, but recapitulate, he says, all the same, I remembered many of the true things they had said about the created world, and I saw that their calculations borne out by mathematics, and regular succession of seasons, and visible evidence of stars. Then he compares to the Manichaeans. It's like, oh, the Manichaeans are full of it. And then he's connecting this to a wider philosophical point in 4. He asks, like, do we need science to be happy? And science is not required for godly happiness. Now, I found a couple modern thinkers who read Augustine and say, like, Augustine is saying, he's saying science, he's anti-science. He's not anti-science. Like, I just read this. He's not anti-science. He is, in fact, pro-science, but it's supplementary, not primary. That's kind of his view on it. He says, if a man is to please you, he's asking God this, surely it is not enough that he should know facts like these. So even if he knows them all, he is not happy unless he knows you. But a man who knows you is happy even if he knows none of these things. And the man who knows you and knows all these things as well is none happier for his knowledge of them. For he is happy only because he knows you. And then he gives an example of this. It's interesting, and this is why he does a lot of pure philosophy, right? They're analogies, just like Mencius, or the whole book of the Republic, right? So this is 95, the subsection 4 in book 5. He says, a man knows that he owns a tree and thanks you for the use of it, even though he does not know the exact height or width of its spread. And it is better than another who measures it and counts it, all its branches, but neither owns it nor knows or loves its creator, right? So if you have a tree that gives you fruit and you're grateful for the tree, it doesn't matter if you know the proportions of your tree, right? Because that's what science means, right? Science is the literal mathematical representation of what the tree is. Same thing, he says, just in the same way, a man who has faith in you owns all the wealth of the world. For if he clings to you, whom all things serve, though he has nothing, he yet owns them all. It would be foolish to doubt that such a man, though he may not know the track of the Great Bear, it's astronomy, or is altogether better than another who measures the sky and counts the stars, but neglects those who allot all things their size, their number, and their weight. So it goes back to that first claim. It's a Greek claim, basically, right? You need to have things outside themselves. Things can't create themselves, logically, at all. So there has to be something external, and ignoring the external thing is the mistake, basically. All right. Yeah, basically that's the conclusion here. True doctrine over science. I think I just had 2 slides. Let me make sure. 5 goes in this a little bit too. Right. He says, but who asked that Manichaeans should write about science as well as religion when they learn our duty to God without knowledge of these things? And he quotes wisdom is fearing the Lord. Even if the Manes did not have true wisdom, he could still have a very good knowledge of science. And then, but worse, what's worse, the Manichaeans knew science, but they had the effrontery to try to teach science. So the Manichaeans were the worst of both worlds, right? They don't know science, and they're not, so they teach fake science and fake religion. Like, it's like a double whammy. So St. Augustine's, by this he's showing you, if you're going to teach anything, at least teach true science. But what's the worst? Like false doctrine and false science? And then he says, what about if the opposite happens? What if somebody came to the church and just didn't understand true science and tried to explain it? Should you, like, kick them out or call them heretics? He said, no. He says, when I hear a brother Christian talk in such a way, where they're ignorant of all science, as a way to show that he's ignorant of those scientific matters and confuses one thing with another, I listen with patience to his theories and think it no harm to him that he does not know the true facts about material things, provided he holds no beliefs unworthy of you, O Lord. And here we go. He says, the danger lies in thinking that such knowledge is part and parcel of what he must believe to save his soul, in presuming to make obstinate declarations about things of which he knows nothing. So he says, it's fine if you're ignorant, especially as a follower, although he says the worst is the Manichaeans who, like, teach false science. So at the very least, the church probably shouldn't do that. That's what he kind of insists. Interesting. All right, and as normal, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll leave this up for a sec while I sip my drink. I'm getting too excited. I don't want to lose my voice. We still got 25 minutes. Let us continue. Make sure everything's still working. Still working. Great. I'm feeling pretty good today. All right. Okay, let's finish this. Okay, now we get back to the main narrative, which is the Manichaeans are back, and they're trying to convince him. And so the other mans, or Manichaeans, but he calls them mans, so I will too, couldn't answer his questions. So he says the whole 9 years, which his mind was unsettled, he basically waited for Faustus for 9 years. And because other people he met in their sect couldn't answer his questions, his scientific questions. Now, when Manus finally arrived, he found a man of agreeable personality, with a pleasant manner of speech, who patterned off the usual Manichaean arguments with a great deal more than the usual charm. But my thirst was not to be satisfied in this way, however precious the cup and however exquisite the man who served it. My ears were already ringing with the tales. They seemed to me none better for being better expressed, nor true simply because they were eloquently told. Neither did I think that pleasant face and a gifted tongue were proof of a wise mind. And he said, those who had given me such assurances about him must have been poor judges. They thought him wise and thoughtful, simply because they were charmed by his manner and speech. So the guy didn't really know anything. But he also mentions the goodwill of Faustus. He showed a lot of goodwill. He was easy to talk to. He enjoyed his rhetoric. But quickly he found it tiresome. And he finally got the guy alone and asked him hard questions. And he realized, this is funny, except for reading Manichaean stuff, the guy had barely read any literature. And remember, Augustine at this point, who isn't a saint yet, was a rhetoric teacher and a literature teacher. So he could see easily, oh man, this guy's illiterate too. He's not read any of it. And then, once it became clear, he asked Faustus to answer his question. But as soon as it became clear that Faustus 7 was quite uninformed about the subjects which I had expected him to be an expert, I began to lose hope that he would lift the veil and solve the problems that perplexed me. And he said he might have actually been a truly pious man. Ignorance didn't stop him from being pious, but he was a Manichae. And he says the Manichaean books are full of the most tedious fictions about the sky and the stars and the sun and the moon. And he badly wanted him to compare these to mathematical calculations. But he didn't do it. He had a heart, though his approach to you was mistaken. That's talking to God again, right? He was not without discretion. He was not entirely unaware of his limitations and did not want to enter rashly into an argument which might force him into a position which he could not possibly maintain and from which he could not easily withdraw. I liked him all the better for this, because his modesty and candor are finer equipment for the mind than scientific knowledge of the mind which I wished to possess. I found the attitude towards all the more difficult and abstruse questions for the same. And then he says, this is the conclusion of this area, the keen interest which I had in the Manichaean doctrines was checked by this experience, and my confidence in other teachers of the sect further diminished when I saw that Faustus, of whom they spoke so much, was obviously unable to settle numerous problems which troubled me. And then, interestingly enough, St. Augustine teaches him. But this totally convinces him of the falsity of the doctrine. And the funny part, he takes Faustus under his wing and is like, hey, you want to study literature with me for fun? So, like, St. Augustine was a nice guy, and he liked Faustus. He's like, oh, let's just study together. And the more they study together, the more he's like, man, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. He's just really clever, right? He's good at speaking, but he had no knowledge of what he was speaking about. And you guys may have run into this too. How do I know? You've seen a politician. See, I told you I'm only going to make non-partisan jokes this week. It's fun that way. But come on, you all must have heard a politician who sounds like they have really nice cliches. Wow. And then they get pushed, and they just like, they uninflate so quickly because there's just nothing behind it. This is poor Faustus. But at least he was humble enough to admit there was nothing behind it. That is not normal in politicians. I'm not going to lie. All right. Let me correct my posture. There we go. It's hard to keep a good posture when I'm stuck in this little room by myself, but I do my best. Okay. Now, finally, we get some movement. He's persuaded to go to Rome. It was then, by your guidance, that I was persuaded to go to Rome to teach there the subjects which I taught at Carthage. And I love it. I will not admit to confess to you how I was persuaded to do this. And he said, even though the pay was on and the honors were greater, that's not actually the reason he went. He said, naturally they influenced me, but the most important reason, and almost the only one, was that I had heard the behavior of young students in Rome was quieter. Discipline was stricter, and they were not permitted to rush insolently and just as they pleased into lecture rooms of teachers who were not their own masters. Imagine just random groups of students running around in the classrooms. It was like, and causing trouble. That's literally what was happening in Carthage. At Carthage, on the other hand, students were beyond control, and their behavior was disgraceful. They would come blustering into lecture rooms like a troop of maniacs and upset the orderly arrangement which the master had made in the interest of his pupils. Their recklessness was unbelievable, and they commit outrages which ought to be punishable by law, but not when the custom protects them. And he said when he was a student, he didn't take part in this behavior, but he really hated it. This didn't happen in Rome, though. So, let's go! Hey! And the funny part, he gets the job. He mentions his mother, who she is the main character of the story, if you haven't figured that out yet. She wept bitterly to see me go and followed me to the water's edge, clinging to me with all her strength in the hope that I would either come home or take her with me. St. Monica's great. I deceived her with the excuse I had a friend whom I did not want to leave until the wind rose and the ship could sail. It was a lie, I told to my own mother, and such a mother too. And he's like, God, thank you for not punishing me for it, because this trip was fine. And this is the best. But she would not go home without me, and it was all I could do to persuade her to stay the night in a shrine dedicated to St. Cyprian, not far from the ship. And this is, oh my goodness. During the night, secretly I sailed away, leaving her alone to tears and her prayers. So his mom is a champ. And she just cried all night. Yeah. And this is the funny part too. For as mothers do, as far as that, far more than most, she loved to have me with her, and she did not know what joys you had in store for her because of my departure. It was a little happy ending, but yeah. His mom, man, she's dedicated. Okay, now, speaking of punishment, he says, at Rome, I was once struck down by illness. which all but carried me off to hell, loaded with all the evil I had committed against you, against myself, and against other men, a host of grave offenses over and above the bonds of original sin. And he said, my fever rose, I came close to dying, close to losing my soul. So he almost died. And he concludes that pretty much the only way he made it out of it is God must be merciful and listen to his mom's prayers, right? Like, that's, yeah, for sure his conclusion. Words cannot describe how dearly she loved me, nor how greatly was the anxiety she suffered for my spiritual birth, than the physical pain she's endured bringing me into the world. And he says, I cannot see how she would have ever recovered if I had died in that condition, for my death would have pierced the very heart of her love. And what would have become of all her prayers if he would have died? So obviously, he lived. And he had to live, right, or there wouldn't be a book. And then he mentions his life in Rome a little bit. He did not, even though he didn't believe the Manichaeans anymore, he is more than happy to hang out with them, especially when they take care of him when he's sick. He's still a mercenary. I love it. Yeah. So he's healed from his sickness. The Manichaeans actually took care of him. Where's this one? We get a couple pages of that, actually. And he does mention, he starts his kind of journey on his encounter with the Christians. 11, he talks about, he thought there could be no answer to the Manichaeans' objections to Christianity at the scriptures, but there was time when he had a genuine wish to discuss these points with someone with profound knowledge. So before he left Carthage, he encountered a guy called Elpidius, who would join he would have open controversies with the Manichaeans, and he had some chances to kind of argue about the Bible, but he's just kind of telling us, he's foreshadowing, right? It's a story. So he had some encounters with it, but he didn't fully get into it. Now, I love it. He gets into the business of teaching literature, and it says, I actively set about the business of teaching literature and public speaking, which is the purpose for which I had come to Rome. And he's pretty successful. It says, at first I taught in my house, where I collected a number of pupils who had heard of me, and through them my reputation began to grow. But now I realize that there were difficulties in Rome which I had not had to contend with in Africa. And true enough, there was not rioting by young hooligans. Isn't that nice? But I was told that at any moment, a number of students would plot together to avoid paying their master his fees, and would transfer as a body to another. They were quite unscrupulous, and justice meant nothing to them compared to the love of money. There was a hatred for them in my heart, and it was not unselfish hatred, for I suppose that I hated them more what I would have to suffer from them than the wrong they might do to any teacher. All at the same students like these are utterly dishonest. They break their troth with you by setting their hearts on fleeting temporal delusions, tainted money, which defiles the hands that grasp it. And he mentions even now he kind of hates them, but he loves them too, hoping to teach them to mend their ways. So he loved them to mend their ways, but he still kind of hates them right there. The students were really bad. Oh, so you trade one problem for another. So you go, moving never fixes your problems. Oh, man. I'm only laughing because it seems to be true. Problems do seem to follow one. And by one, I mean humans. And it seems like St. Augustine's on the same page. I think he'd agree with that. Okay. So to escape Rome, he actually applies for a position in Milan. They wanted a literature teacher. So basically, the governor of the city is like, we don't have enough literature teachers. We need another one. And he applies for it. And actually, the Manichaeans he hangs out with, they endorse him. And he gets the job. And he says, in Milan, I found your devoted servant, the Bishop Ambrose, who is known throughout the world as a man, whom there were very few equal in goodness. And why did he start going? Well, it says here. At the time, his gifted tongue never tired, dispensing richness of your corn, the joy of your oil, and the sober intoxication of your wine. He said, my heart warmed to him, not at first as a teacher of truth, which I had quite despaired in finding in your church, but simply as a man who showed me kindness. And he liked his preaching style. He was very good at his job. But originally he was not interested in the subject matter at all. Let's see. But then we get to 14. He started to internalize the teachings, right? Obviously, this is a conversion story, so eventually he has to convert, right? And Ambrose, who becomes Saint Ambrose, there's a lot of saints in this story, shows you kind of the power of it anyway. So he says, although I did not trouble to take what Ambrose said to heart, but only to listen to the manner which he said it, this being the only paltry interest that remained to me now that I had lost hope that a man could find a path led to you, nevertheless, his meaning, which I tried to ignore, found its way into my mind together with his words, which I admired so much. So it started to work. And one of the biggest catch-ups for St. Augustine, this one's very sympathetic to me. He said, first of all, it struck me that it was, after all, possible to vindicate arguments. I began to believe the Catholic faith, which I had thought impossible to defend against the objections of the Manichees, might fairly be maintained, especially since I had heard one passage after another of the Old Testament, which figuratively explained. These passages had been deaf to me when I took them literally, but once I had heard them explained in their spiritual meaning, I began to blame myself for my despair, at least insofar as it had led me to suppose that it was quite impossible to counter people who hated and derided the law and the prophets. So basically what saved him from, Ambrose was a really good teacher, and he basically explained scriptures well, and he explained the different layers of meaning in them. They're not pure, they're literal and other stuff. It's not just literal. And again, right, if you're claiming that the logic of the universe helped write a book, it makes sense the book would have layers, right? Like, does human written literature and history and philosophy have layers? I mean, we've been reading it, right? Obviously it does. So if a religion claimed a God wrote a book, wouldn't that have layers too? It's a good question. He said, though the Catholic side unbeaten but still not victorious, he was still not believing it all the way. Now, this is interesting too. He gets into, let me quote this, he said, I tried my utmost to find some certain proof which would convict the Manichees of falsehood. He said, but this I could not do. However, the more I thought about the material world, the whole of nature as far as can be aware through the bodily senses, and the more I took stock in the various theories, the more I began to think that the opinions of the majority of the philosophers were most likely to be true. So treating everything as a matter of doubt, as the academics are generally supposed to do, and hovering between one doctrine and another, I made up my mind to at least leave the Manichees. And he became a catechumen of the Catholic Church. But he basically is a cynic at this point. Cynic is the philosophy that comes out of Aristotelian, Platonic thought, except they don't want to accept the forms. So they're empiricists, we can only trust visual reality. So then we have to be skeptical of everything, because how can we even trust our own senses? Which, it's actually a good question. Alright, any questions so far? We'll start 6. I don't think we're going to finish 6. We only got 8 minutes or so. But anything I can clarify before we keep going? You guys have way better questions than I have any right to appreciate, so you guys do a good job, so I always like to give time for that. I'll give it 20 seconds. Alright, I think I saw something pop up. Let's see. Yeah, quick question. The book book 10 talks about evil. Is there obvious distinction between evil and darkness, or do they mean the same thing? Well, that's a good question. They're often used as synonyms, Because remember how the light, I mean, in the Old Testament, like in Israeli Hebrew imagery, God is light, evil is darkness. But in it's a pretty universal thing. In Greek thought too, right? Intelligible reality is the sun, and the dark cave is the wrongness. So evil and darkness are synonymous, as in away from the light. Does that make sense? St. Augustine has probably my favorite definition of evil, which is away from God. That's what evil means, right? So it's you're departing from the good. And in Augustine's theory, he actually thinks that evil can only be in good things that lack their goodness. So that's kind of his definition of evil. So evil is departing from goodness. That's what it means. Does that help answer the question? There's differences, but they're not. It's not a substantial difference, I would say. Yeah. Great. Okay, that's a good question. Let us keep cracking. How much time do we got? 5 minutes. Okay, we'll start this slide. Maybe. Hold on. Let me check my notes. Okay, we'll do a couple. We gotta at least talk about the mom. The mom just does her thing. I love this mom. St. Monica's amazing. Book 6, chapter 1. He asks where God is, and then he talks about his mom. By now my mother had come to me, for her piety had given her strength to follow me over land and sea, facing all perils in the sure faith she had in you. And then we get a fun story about his mom here. When the ship was in danger, it was she who put heart into the crew. The very man whom the passengers, unused to the sea, turned to for reassurance when they are alarmed. She promised them they would make the land safely, because you had given her the promise of a vision. And she found true he was in grave danger, so she had to go. So the mom is just... We get a little bit of the mom's character. She is a rock, man. This mom is... I like her a lot. She's a fun character. She really likes her son. Hopefully we'll have a mom so dedicated. Okay, and then we get a little bit more about his mom. He mentions his mother's custom in Africa was to take meal cakes and bread and wine to shrines of the saint on memorial days. And they'd give a little bit to the saint and share the rest. St. Ambrose was against this offering because it felt too pagan. And the mom changed because she respects St. Ambrose so much. The current opinion in the church is mostly... don't give food. Now it's interesting, this is a very common, because we're doing comparative classics, in Asian veneration of the dead, you do give them food and snacks and drinks and stuff. Still in like family shrines. Doesn't happen in China very much anymore because they tried to delete that. But in Korea or Taiwan or especially Japan, in your house you'll have like a shrine to your dead ancestors and you can offer them food and stuff. But for Christians, like, it's a little too pagan, let's get rid of that. But the mom respected, this shows you how St. Ambrose, how like kind of strong his personality was. St. Augustine's mom changed her opinion almost immediately. Although, he does say... that probably only St. Ambrose could have corrected his mom. She probably wouldn't have followed anybody else. And we get a little bit about St. Ambrose's personality here. Because he could show me the way of salvation, she was greatly devoted to Ambrose. And his heart, too, had warmed to her for her truly pious way of life, her zeal in good works, and her regular church-going. Often when he saw me, he would break out in praise of her, congratulating me on having such a mother. So now we're trying to get this connection. St. Ambrose knows who St. Augustine is now. Now, we get a little bit about Ambrose's character on 6.3. Even though I thought of Ambrose simply as a man who was fortunate, as the world appraised his fortune, because he held such high esteem by such important people. His celibacy seemed to me the only hardship he had to bear. By the way, if you don't know, in this part of the church history, celibacy was optional, not mandatory, like it is in the Roman Church now. In the Eastern Church, it's still, priests are married, monks and nuns are celibate. In the first 1,000 years of both churches, celibacy was a choice, right? Like Ambrose is a bishop, but he could choose to be celibate. And celibate just means you don't do sexy times. That's what it means. And for Augustine, he liked sex a lot. I mean, the quote from the back of the book, right? We'll get there eventually. But his celibacy seemed the hardest thing to bear. As for his secret hopes, his struggles against temptations, which must come to one so highly placed, the consolation he found in adversity, and the joy he knew in the depths of his heart when he fed on your bread, but those were quite beyond my surmise, they lay outside my experience. For his part, he did not know how I was tormented or how deeply I was engulfed in danger. I could not ask him questions I wished to ask in the way I wished to ask them, because so many people used to keep him busy with the problems that I was prevented from talking face to face. And it is interesting, right? Except when he was eating, and he'd read a lot, but he would always let people approach him no matter what he was doing, which for any kind of spiritual leader, this is always impressive, right? It's not like Megan and Plant. It's like all could approach him freely, and it was not unusual for visitors to be announced, so that often when we came to see him, we found him reading like this in silence, for he never read aloud. So people felt bad to interrupt him, but he'd always let people come talk to him no matter what he was doing. He said, in all of the events I had no chance to probe the heart of this man, your holy oracle, with the questions I wished to put to him, unless it was some matter which could be treated briefly. He never had a chance to do everything and confess everything to him, but he said, yet every Sunday I listened as he preached the word of true to the people, and I grew more and more certain that it was possible to unravel the tangle woven by those who deceived me. So he's working his way towards understanding. Now, I'm out of time, or I would keep going. We're totally out of time. So if you have an extra question or two, I'll try to answer those. But otherwise, we'll call it here, and we'll be back next Tuesday. Yeah. My aspirations are to have your papers, the first paper definitely done, paper 3. But if I can do 4 as well, that'd be my dream this weekend. I'm going to do a lot of grading this weekend. So, yeah, keep that in mind. Hopefully that's all done. Besides that, though, if you have any other questions, I'll answer them in the Discord. And thank you for everybody who randomly watched us. Thank you so much. I hope you got something from this. And we'll be back next week, finish off St. Augustine. After that, we're going to do Tale of the Heike. Have a great weekend, everybody. I'll see you then. Bye-bye now.